Hey guys, this is Apartment Reef, and just wanted to welcome you to my recording of my reef tank. I'm going to leave it in the background while we discuss what it means to have reef keeping success, how to define it, and how we can strive towards it. The first thing I want to say is congratulations to Mike Paletta, who has now been in the hobby for approximately 40 years at this point. Hopefully, there are many more on the horizon. So, with that out of the way, I would say that as far as defining reef keeping success, really, in my opinion, what defines success is a few things. There's a natural sort of peace in the tank, a coexistence. There's a lack of coral allelopathy or coral warfare, but sometimes that can happen depending on how often you prune your corals or trim them back. There's an element of stability, usually determined by testing, but not always. And your tank is molded with the purpose you desire for it. And what I mean with that is the tank holds a purpose, whether that's how you want it to look, or whether it fulfills a personal desire, or if that purpose is for sales. And you've been successful at molding that tank along with the help of nature as a mutual partnership over time. So, how do you get there? How do you know you're there? Well, I would say there's probably 19 key things that we're going to go through if we have time that I find help better define reef tank success. And the first of those is a lack of emotional regulation, or rather, having emotional regulation. And what I mean by that is no reef tank is going to be a linear function from 0 to 100, or whatever you define as success. It is always going to have ups and downs, and it's going to look like a spaghetti noodle. And the reason being for that is, one, we're not perfect. And if it's your first tank, it's definitely not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have problems that you find. And the key here is to never trade off a short-term perceived benefit of a positive emotion for what will ultimately become a long-term detriment. And for me, that means that if you look at a tank and you go, oh, I don't want to clean the tank today. Well, maybe you should. Maybe the ounce of pain that you feel cleaning the tank is going to help you get closer to your goal. And I'm not going to tell you that's right or wrong, because there are many different ways to run a reef tank. And I think we all know that. And hopefully that's something that you will come to appreciate over time. And finding ways to circumnavigate that boredom is going to be key to long-term success in the hobby, because it traces back to your emotional regulation. If you can avoid that short-term payoff, you're going to find a lot of success. And that also comes down to, understanding that you're going to sometimes get fish that have an attitude, or you're not going to have the funding or the money to take care of an issue immediately, and you're going to have to get creative. It's very fortunate the hobbyist who has unlimited income to solve all their problems. But I will say that it is not a magic bullet. There are some problems that don't require money, and a lot of them are easier solved without thinking you need to go to the store and buy a product. This all boils down to avoiding things like tank crashes, and I hate to say it, but planning properly for vacations, and basically looking into your equipment, getting backup equipment, making sure that if a heater fails, you already have a backup one available. You're not rushing to a store or doing an Amazon next day air order. You have backup equipment, and you know how to clean that equipment, and you clean it regularly. Not just for the benefit of the reef or the tank, not just because some guy on the forums or I told you so, but because you have a goal in mind and you need to identify that goal. And whenever you have short-term doubts or things that are dragging you down, you need to look at that goal and say, I need to do this to get to that goal. Because if you don't, you will eventually have problems. And I can tell you from experience, not in reefing, but just in life, that once you start passing problems over, they have a funny way of coming back and surprising you when you least expect it. And when that happens, you can't identify the problem. And again, this comes back to number one, having emotional regulation. Because everything in a reef tank that is good tends to happen slow. Everything that is bad tends to happen quickly. And at the end of the day, a lot of changes that you make in your tank are going to take probably 2, maybe even 3 or 4 weeks for you to notice a change, if it's positive. There are some things that you can adjust, like alkalinity or your pH, your nitrates, your phosphates. You can adjust those. But generally speaking, identifying trends is a long-term process. That's why they call them trends. Successful trends tend to have a long track record, and they aren't necessarily the most exciting. That just goes for anything in life. The next thing I want to talk about is tank moves. There might come a time where you'll have to move your tank, or maybe a lifestyle change. Maybe you're moving into a house or an apartment, or you're going to college. Let me say this. If you can't have a tank up for 3 years, you're probably going to be disappointed with what you can do in a reef tank, unless you get like a fish-only tank or a fowler tank or some sort of easier tank like a Zoa tank. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying stability comes with time, and if you want less maintenance, you're going to be looking at stability as your saving grace. The more stability you have, the less maintenance you will have to do. You will not get out of doing maintenance, but you will be doing less maintenance. And I think part of that just comes with time in the hobby and understanding that sometimes the things that reefers and people on forums perceive as problems may not actually be problems for your specific aquarium. And that's okay. That's something worth acknowledging. If things aren't actively dying and your water tests come back okay, and you have no pests and you have no diseases, you shouldn't be messing with anything. That's a very simple formula for success if you're cleaning equipment regularly and changing your water. But too much of a good thing can also cause problems. I used to do weekly water changes on this specific tank that we're looking at, of a 5-gallon water change, which really isn't much. And then I began getting dinos every week because my water was just too clean. And you can tell, like, I have all this turf algae, if you've been watching. And The fish pick at it, they enjoy it, and it sucks up a lot of those nutrients. So my skimmer typically is never filling up before I'm cleaning it again. But that's a good thing. And you can still see all this particulate in the water. You know, particulate in the water is a good thing. Particulates can be food. I know everybody wants to have a perfectly clean tank, but if every one of these white dots is some sort of copepod floating around looking for a place to land, that's a good environment. And we don't have the ability to look at every single white dot floating around. So who are we to judge what good water versus bad water looks like? I guess the next thing that I will say is, because of these commitments, there's an inherent time commitment to taking care of a reef tank. When you have a problem, you need to be able to address that problem if it's something that needs to be addressed. And that means having a foundational knowledge base. And when I say foundational knowledge base, I don't mean reading reef to reef. I don't mean watching podcasts necessarily or reading forums. But what I do mean is reading books, learning about algae, learning about dinoflagellates, learning about diatoms, learning about corals, learning about water chemistry, learning about biology, learning about all these things and how they all tie together into this beautiful marriage that we call a coral reef. And then figuring out, how does that correlate? How can I transfer that knowledge into an aquarium that is the size of a 55-gallon drum, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, and make a biome out of it? And the answer is, that's up for you to figure out. This stability, there's more than one way to run a reef tank. And I think what you're going to find as time goes on is, if you invest in building foundational knowledge about things like diseases and, environmental concerns, product issues, coexistence, allelopathy, water chemistry, how much time it takes you to do things, understanding that in the future you might have family commitments or a physical ability that renders you incapable of dealing with a tank or an illness, understanding funding and money and the problems and ways to circumnavigate that, understanding how to circumnavigate sometimes disinterest or boredom in a safe way that won't bring instability to your tank, understanding things like pests and how they come and how they go and how to handle them. And again, these are not things that anybody can teach you in one singular video. These are things that you learn by taking an hour or two out of your day, picking a topic, and just absorbing everything you can about that topic, and then going out and finding some books and reading those books. And then when you think you're done and you think you've absorbed that knowledge, go back and read them again. Because the first time you read something, you're going to do it until you're tired or until you're bored, or you might try and go while you're bored, which is even worse. So at the end of the day, you just need to make sure you build that foundational knowledge. And I'll give you an example. I just watched or listened to the Reef Beef podcast for this week. It is July 29th, 2024, or maybe it was the week prior, or the week prior to that. I don't really know. I don't pay a lot of attention to the date. That's probably why I'm good at reefing. I don't look at what day it is. I don't look at how long I've been in this. I just go in and I take care of what needs to be taken care of, and then I leave it be. But anyway, I was listening to this Reef Beef podcast, and I was listening to Jonathan, who, if you've never heard of Jonathan, he's amazing. You need to go check out all of his content. But he was talking about, essentially, dinoflagellates. And there's more than one way to deal with a dinoflagellate, but What I thought was interesting was he didn't appreciate the answers he was getting on forums or websites necessarily. He decided, I'm going to build some foundational knowledge in regards to this and see where it takes me. Hopefully I can get an answer. And so what did he do? He learned about dinoflagellates and the different species and how those species act in nature and their life cycles. And once you come to understand these animals, then you can create a plan of action to deal with them. And sometimes, in the case of dinoflagellates, that is nothing. Doing nothing is sometimes the best thing. But what I'm trying to get at here is there's a lot of people who try to treat dinoflagellates, or they try to treat these things, and not everything needs to be treated. There's a certain level of understanding where it just doesn't make sense. At what point does it make sense to treat an algaecide in a tank with coral holobionts that rely on algae to live? It just doesn't make any sense. And I don't care, what your outlook on that is. It doesn't make sense. And what it boils down to is the tanks that develop these problems are usually of any size, but they have a lack of ecological balance. And every reef tank is a battlefield for dominance of energy, whether that's solar energy or sugar-based energy or bacterial-based energy or protein-based energy, whatever it might be. Everything in a reef tank is competing to be number one, and that means dominance. And in the ocean, this is fine, because a patch of ocean the size of a 1,500-gallon tank or a 4,000-gallon tank, that's only the size of a boat, maybe a little bit bigger. That's not a big deal in the ocean, because things can exist in other places. Just because you win a battle here doesn't mean you win the war. And that's how you need to look at dinos and diatoms and slime like cyanobacteria. And as soon as you realize that, you realize, if I'm going to stock a reef tank, I'm going to put things in that reef tank that can help manage those problems best. And the tanks that I find have the most problems are the tanks where people are putting purely decorative fish in their tanks, and they don't have enough of a cleanup crew. They don't have enough snails or hermit crabs or small enough urchins, small enough snails, small enough crabs. Or they're looking at things as pests. They go, oh, how do I get rid of my bristleworms? Well, bristleworms can come and go. Their population can rise and fall, and so it's always kind of adjusting, which is a good thing. You didn't have to pay for bristleworms. They just showed up. They eat your man, I can't think of the term. Starts with a D. They eat your detritus. And, that's a good thing. It helps things digest in the tank and complete the cycle. And it also means you're overfeeding. Asterina starfish, another thing Jonathan brought up that Jake Adams had brought up in a brief podcast, God, probably 2 or 3, maybe even 4 years ago, was they're actually called Aquilonastra starfish. There's something like 25 different species. Some of them eat corals, some of them eat bacteria, some of them eat certain kinds of algae. So, there's an aspect to that where, depending on what species it is, they might be feeling a little, this blur on this camera is just getting, they might be feeling a little kind of niche in your reef tank. And believe me, your reef tank is a niche. So let the niches exist. You see that coral in the back? That one with the red cyanobacteria? I could go suck all that out. I haven't. It hasn't grown. You see all that turf algae? I could go pull all that out. In fact, I've done it a lot. But, I'm not going to treat my tank with algaecides. I'm a firm believer that if you have algae, you need more coral. And Sometimes that means for a certain space, some corals just won't work. And that's okay. You'll notice I have a lot of GSP in my tank, but it hasn't taken over. Same thing. There's actually Xenia in this tank too, but you don't even see it. Why? Because competition elsewhere. There are other things demanding the nutrients. It's not necessarily how fast you suck up the nutrients. Sometimes it's just how big you are soaking up nutrients. What else would I like to discuss? I guess for me, blue lights are not enough light. Corals need light. Do not be afraid to put your corals under highlight. They might pale a bit, but that's okay, because it's not about the color of the coral. It's about the health of the coral. And your corals are going to get healthier the more energy you can give them. And you're going to have better growth the more energy you can give them. I know everybody likes blue light, but there's a reason why halide 14K spectrum grows coral like nobody's business. It puts out energy, and the corals like that energy. It grows algae too, but growing corals is growing algae, period. There's no way around that. So if you want to grow corals and not algae, get more coral. Grow more coral. Don't let the algae get the best of you. Just grow more coral. You see this big bird's nest? I've been wanting to take this thing out of the tank for so long, but I haven't, because it's filling a spot that would be taken up by algae. So I knock a little bit back every week, and I try to let the other corals grow to absorb that, and I watch my alkalinity to make sure that happens. Because otherwise, if I just took that whole thing out, I'd have an algae bloom, or the algae would take over. So it's all about preserving status quo. And the better you get at that, the better a reefer you're going to be. Of course, everybody has a moment. There's every great chapter in a reefer's life. So, I haven't read many books about reefers, but I have read a lot of books about artists and famous people, and every famous person always has, specifically artists, has a chapter called something like The Flood, or The Fire, or, The Injury. So I say this: be aware. Accidents can happen, and be aware that, attentiveness is going to save you from having that chapter in your book. Maybe not. I haven't really tested that theory. It seems like pretty much everybody gets a chapter called The Flood or The Fire. I already have my Flood chapter, and I've already had my Fire chapter. But that's a story for another time. I really appreciate you coming here and talking about reef tank success with me and what that means for me. You notice I didn't talk about any additives or anything like that. I talked about staying on top of your water chemistry and staying on top of your animals and trying to preserve that balance.